Responsible AI with Greg Leonardo.
The Azure DevOps Podcast is a show for developers and DevOps professionals shipping software using Microsoft technologies. Each show brings you hard-hitting interviews with industry experts, innovating better methods, and sharing success stories. Listen on to learn how to increase quality, ship quickly, and operate well. And now your host, Jeffrey Palermo.
Welcome to the show. I'm Jeffrey Palermo, your host for helping you and your teams move fast, deliver quality, and to run your software with confidence in Azure, all while using everything that the .NET ecosystem has to offer. This podcast is sponsored by ClearMeasure, a software architecture company that empowers .NET teams to be self-sufficient and able to deliver world-class results through its ClearMeasure Way methodology for effective software delivery. My architect forums are going pretty strong. Signups for the next session are up. The link is in the show notes. If you lead a software team and are looking to collaborate with peer lead architects, then just go ahead and sign up, and we'd love to have you in that forum. And for those of you who are looking for Programming with Palermo, my video podcast, just search in any of the directories or on YouTube and you'll be able to find it. Our guest today on the show, return guest, is Greg Leonardo. And Greg is a cloud architect that assists organizations with cloud adoption and innovation and is currently a public cloud architect at AT&T. He's been working in the IT industry since his time in the military and is a developer, teacher, speaker, and early adopter. Greg has worked in many facets of IT throughout his career and is currently the president of TampaDev, a community meetup that runs Tampa CC, Tampa Code Camp, and various technology events throughout Tampa, Florida. And he also holds a certification as a Microsoft certified Azure Solutions Architect Expert, as well as a Microsoft certified trainer, and is an Azure MVP. That's Microsoft Most Valuable Professional. Greg, welcome back to the show. How are you, sir?
Yes, sir. Doing great. How about yourself?
Pretty good. Pretty good. We talked last time, you kind of were writing a book. You've written any latest books? You crank one out in the last 6 months?
No, I think I'm going to retire from that ball of wax for a while. Recording books is definitely a lot more intensive than people think.
Yeah, lots of work. Well, so we'll include a link to show number 205. The last time that you were on the show, people can go back and look at that. But for people who didn't listen to that, or maybe haven't heard you speak, or haven't visited the Code Camp or TampaDev, give us a little bit of a background on yourself and maybe high points of your career that have kind of landed you what you're focusing on today.
Well, I think, in our prior conversations, I'm a military veteran from First Gulf War. I learned a lot while in the military, and I also got out, because of, different things that happened in the military, my EOS being one of them. So I went into the technology arena, and I grew up in going through help desks and then building up to fixing machines and different things like that. And then I moved over to development and then architecture. And I've kind of really never really found a home until, the cloud came around, because that was the more kind of breadth that everybody, kind of moved towards, was how to provide value where your compute was a service style of thing, to where you didn't have to, sink money into all of these different things. Right.
Yeah.
So that's kind of where, my career, I've worked from everywhere from financial industries to telephone companies. So I've pretty much covered the gambit of every technology field out there. Our main focus has always been, you give a guy a fish, you feed him for a day, you teach him how to fish, you feed him for a lifetime. So our whole point in everything that we do is always about how can we give back to our community, not let alone our professional community, but our veteran community as well, to ensure how we can get folks trained in technology, or at least introduced to technology so that they understand it rolling forward. So that's been a key point, as throughout the history of, because we've known each other for, long time now.
Yeah. I wonder if it's been 18 years. I'm sure 2005 or 6 is what sticks in my mind. Anyway, somewhere around there. Yeah.
Somewhere around there.
Longer than some listeners have been alive.
Exactly.
Well, no. Yeah.
Well, kind of close.
Actually, we have some high school listeners. So
exactly. There we go.
So we're going to be talking about responsible AI today. And previous episode we had with Matthew Renzi also was on different slant because he's doing some artificial intelligence work, and a lot of other people are. But what has piqued your interest where you're focusing on this, where you put the word responsible before artificial intelligence? Is it inherently irresponsible?
Well, I think with everything new, as you and I have figured out through our history and our experiences in life, is that sometimes things can be taken out of context. And one of the main things that you look at from the pretense of AI has been brought out or taunted as something that compares facts or goes and looks for facts and presents those facts to you. Responsible AI is really about the fact of removing bias and lying from the system to where or leading from the system. So the way I look at AI is that it should be a lawyer in a courtroom, right? You have leading information or you have things that may or may not be true. AI should be presenting things in their raw form or raw fact, allowing your biases to form your opinion off the data that's given to you, not have all of that done before you get it, if that makes sense.
Mm, okay. Would that presume, in that reality, would then the models that they're based on have to actually have all information? Because I would imagine if they only had a subset of information, that would be inherently biased.
Well, that's the point, right? So as we program things and as things are developed in the world, there always enters a bias by the people that program them, right?
Mm-hmm.
Whether it's conscious bias or not. You go into things looking for a specific result, and especially as developers. Well, the AI to me shouldn't give you a result. It should just present the facts, right? And if you want it to extrapolate that, you can train it to do those extrapolations. But at that point, it's not the main avenue, if that makes sense. So you have to think of it like a personal assistant, right? You go hire a personal assistant. They're not going to know the type of coffee that you like, all the other different things, or how you like to communicate, or how you like your meetings done, and all that sort of stuff. So over time, they figure that stuff out to where it no longer
Mm-hmm.
becomes a conversation, right? It's kind of about that same thing. As you go through life, your AI should become your best friend, but presenting you with the facts. But, it may be able to come to conclusions on what you would think based on prior things that you've done,
Mm.
right? But at the end of the day, we've seen a lot of things on the internet, especially from the perspective of digesting large amounts of data, that sometimes that data is correct, sometimes it's not. So AI has to be able to weed through what is rooted in fact and
Mm-hmm.
what isn't, so that in turn it knows how to decipher and work itself through what is important, what is not. We don't want an AI system that throws out the least common denominator and the most common denominator and then finds something in between, right? You wanted to take into account all of that based on the facts that support each one of the pieces it's trying to present. So it is kind of a conundrum that we need to stay in front of, right? Not We don't want to stay behind, because if it becomes the exo facto of where facts are being presented and AI learns to lie, then what happens to society at the end of the day? Or it learns how to skirt the truth, or it learns how to kind of work you down a path, right? So again, it's not allowing you to formulate something, it's programming you how to formulate that, which can be super dangerous in a lot of things. You and I, with our military background, have seen that throughout even our histories and the propagandas of how wars go and things like that, that you see these things that you don't want to be exasperated by technology. So I think
Yeah.
that's why we have to stay in front of it.
So there are these public models put out by the big companies like Microsoft and Google, and probably more to come. And Azure has the OpenAI service where you can tap into the GPT model that was built up behind Chat GPT that everybody's talking about, and integrate that into applications. And so there's that aspect of it. And then there's the other aspect of creating your own model by choosing your own set of data using the GPT technology to analyze that data. Talk about the differences between those and how you like to think about how to use each one.
Well, there's a little bit of subtle dichotomy in the discussion that goes there, right? Because you're talking about there's a difference to me when you look at data and where that data is rooted, right? Because we've always known the source of truth, right? When you look at things specifically in the lens of history, let's say, there are facts in history that are not approachable, right? Because they happened. You can't change them. You can't hope for a different outcome. You can't change what that outcome was because it happened.
Mm-hmm.
However, there can be some gray points into what you ask about that particular history, right? That could enter in an area that could skirt its tail on whether it's fact or fiction at the end of the day, or an assumption based off of a bias that may have been introduced, right? So the problems that I see today is that what we strive for in a lot, when you look at those public models applied to our data, is we're looking for affirmation. The point behind fact is not the affirmation of you being right. It's the affirmation that it is fact-based off of something. So you've got to really play in the arena of what you're trying to do. Let's think about what's happened today just with social media, right? We used to have to where, when you didn't want to hear things or you didn't want to focus, you didn't pay attention or you didn't listen, right?
Mm-hmm.
But then you had to learn in social media that you couldn't not listen anymore because they became more of echo chambers or more around like-minded folks getting together and not allowing other inputs in, right? That's the danger of AI if you don't allow other inputs in and you allow it to formulate decisions that are based around a microcosm of what you're really asking it to do. So that's where I see the dangers, right? We can go into AI, but AI has to have the ability, like our brain does, to be able to kind of throw the BS flag when it needs to and go, well, wait, you're looking at this, but here's the facts that go into this that we can kind of work that out. Because to me, it's all about a give or take. So while, and it's a court of law function, right? When you go into a court of law, one side says another thing, the other side rebuts it, and you find out something in the middle that's then deciphered by other people, right? So you're giving a swag of what the reality is across multiple things, and then you're allowing things to kind of discuss that. That to me is how AI has to do. It has to be a mini courtroom that's then discussed by a whole bunch of other things over here so that it comes to what is real about what you just presented based about what you're asking it, but also about what went into that process as well. Because, if you came out and just gave it, data that said the sky was purple and that was the only data you give it, well, the end result of AI is the sky's going to be purple, right? But we all know that there's idiosyncrasies that go into that change the color of the sky depending on how much water's in it. So that has to be introduced as a fact in order to to get to that fact-finding mission of what it is that you're trying to get from an end result, if that makes sense.
Yeah. You mentioned the facts and the facts going into the model. Let's maybe sort out some of these terms, because AI is being thrown around now almost as a synonym for GPT, whereas over the decades, AI has been used to describe all kinds of things, and then they productize, and then you stop calling it AI. So I just want to confirm, for the whole premise of this conversation, are you specifically talking about GPT or anything else as well?
Well, let's go across the gambit, right? So AI has been used in several fronts. AI to me is artificial intelligence.
Mm-hmm.
That could metastasize as Chat GPT or iRobot, right? So let's look at our history and we'll go back to the movies, right? We had Terminator. So we had an AI that came back that figured out that humans were bad because that's the assumption. It hunted humans out throughout history and throughout timelines, right? In order to correct facets, right? Then you had iRobot, right? Which was an artificial intelligence that really couldn't hurt humans. However, then somebody mischievously took that over and then created something that wasn't there, right? So you have all these approaches to where this should be the general thing. The idea of taking AI and looking at the lens to tell us if we were a good society or not probably isn't the best use of that, because everything in society starts out at a place for bad before it heads to good, right? Because nobody tries to solve a good problem, right? They always try to solve a bad problem, right? You and I both know you don't learn from success, you learn from failure, right? So you have to really look at the dichotomy of how all that works together. So when you start discussing these things or heading down a path of what AI is something that's across the board, that is basically something that doesn't particularly have a soul, that is making automated decisions based on an input. Doesn't matter what that input is. Doesn't matter what avenue you put it on. It could be a robot, it could be a chat engine, it could be a browser, it doesn't matter, right? But what you have to look at it for is it has to be seated in a fact-finding mission, because if it's not, where are we left? We're left with, eventually it becomes Terminator and figures out we're the problem. Is that really the problem it was supposed to solve? Or we become iRobot, where we put all these safeguards in place, and then somebody in turn then tries to use it for their advantage, right? So after adoption. So this is where I say that the carefulness of things have to come out of this, because if people use things in a mischievous way, we may not discover that up front. However, it can be done in the back. And you have to think about, you talk that we have folks watching this podcast that are in high school. Those are the people where their minds become influential. You and I worked with an organization, the military, that we saw propaganda used against, different avenues of populations, right?
It's part of the
Do
strategy.
we really want somebody to do that? At the end of the day, when it's being taunted as this is now the fact, right? And you can't do that. There has to be a safeguard in that arena.
I think that's a really good point. With so many people since last November playing around with Chat GPT and now Google Bard, which is kind of finally out, and people are playing around with that, and the new Bing Chat, which is, I think, under the covers, it's using the same OpenAI model.
GPT. Yeah,
Chat
GPT under the covers.
Essentially the same database. But you made a good point. If we ask questions of this model, of this GPT database, just in layman's terms, it's not giving us back fact. It's giving us back guesses. But if we treat it as fact, we're going to go astray. I've read countless articles talking about the lies and hallucinations, they call it. They don't call it lies. They call it hallucinations of the GPT models. But for developers, for people who are thinking, you know what? I could probably take this Azure OpenAI service and do something interesting in my applications. What is actionable right now for developers? And when they're doing it, how should they be designing it?
Many thanks to our podcast sponsor, ClearMeasure. ClearMeasure is a software architecture company that empowers clients' development teams to be self-sufficient, moving fast, delivering quality, and running their systems with confidence. Whether starting a new project or developing new technologies or techniques, ClearMeasure sets up your team to deliver world-class results. Learn more at www.clearmeasure.com. ClearMeasure, empowering software delivery. ClearMeasure is also happy to be a sponsor of the video podcast, Programming with Palermo. Watch, learn, and program alongside Chief Architect Jeffrey Palermo. Videos are added weekly and available on syndicated locations supporting video podcast or by visiting palermo.network. Tune in today.
Right. So now you hit on the main point that I looked at, right? When you go write code or you use something like Copilot, it is rooted in fact. You and I both know that. There's only ways to write code, right? You can write permutations of that code, but it doesn't matter. At the end of the day, it's still rooted in fact. That code has to work to get a result, right? And that result is whatever you define that result to be. So that, to me, is much more of an easy path for adoption. Doing the things that you can quantify at the end of the day, as we're learning how to develop and move AI to much, different places, and how to remove biases from it and all those other different things when you start getting to areas that can be a lot more gray than, say, coding, right? Like how to socially interact, right? That's a much more gray area than coding is, because that's based on individual points, right? Not really rooted in a fact-based thing like a coding or, even inventory management, right? You either have inventory, you don't. There are applications of AI that could make people's jobs a lot easier because there is no interpretation or guessing, right? As you put it. The problem behind it is we as humans have evolved with such a complex brain about how to weed out the guesses and make them more real because of the follow-up things that we do to figure out whether it's real or not, right? When we go in and say, that's a cat, or how many times have you heard that somebody on a boat that ended up saving something in the ocean and they thought it was a dog but found out it was a rat, right? There's a point in this that through our process, there has to be things to get us to a point to where that decision is. And even people, when it's right in front of them, can make that mistake if they don't have the experience to kind of throw that thing in the way. And that's the problem to me with something like Chat GPT or this current push, is because we don't want Chat GPT to call that a dog, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because at the end of the day, it's a rat. But it made an assumption based on the same assumption a human would make, which is the same people that program them. So you can see where this conundrum comes in, that it's almost like, to me, that Chat GPT has to learn like a child so that it has its own experiences and models that are built in so that it knows how to call BS rather than trying to make a guess based around its programming model and a never-ending battle of yes or no's to get to the certain point, right?
Okay. So do you think there's more opportunity in using a model that somebody else has built up, like Microsoft, Google, whatnot, IBM, or to build up your own model?
See, that's the interesting phenomenon. I was asked when I gave this talk a while ago on just that, because the avenue of it is as humans, we're not perfect. So bias is always going to step in. So you either grab the bias that comes in from somebody doing it, or you program your own in. So it's really those particular points that when you're looking for something at that level, the big thing that you have to do is start out at a point of purity, right? And a source of truth. And if you don't do that, it doesn't matter what any permutations you put out there, because if you don't root it in something, you're only going to get the biases of whoever does it. I may not like the answer that I get, so I go create my own model to get the answer that I want. It doesn't always mean it's the correct answer. And that's the whole conundrum in this, right? As long as we're looking for affirmation about things rather than the facts, there's a difference between fact and affirmation, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because in fact, there is no argument about it. But in affirmation, that's just for people to go, oh, I agree with that or I don't. And that's not how all this should play out at the end of the day, unless you're looking for complex social structures that aren't rooted in anything. So that's why I said there's a super conundrum in all of this that we have to be careful with, because at some point it has to make a guess based on how you, Jeff Palermo, would react in this situation, right? Because it's learned something about you versus you looking for that affirmation and how you're interacting, right? It's like Chat GPT, how did this email sound, right? And it giving you input. Well, according to your writing style, this is where I found the problem was at, because you kind of got off track in these two spots or something like that. So it's giving you evaluation based on how you would approach something.
Mm-hmm.
However, if you look for the fact in that email and you said, okay, but was what I said correct? Then that's where it comes in going, well, you were kind of wrong on this Azure thing over here because that doesn't do that anymore or something like, so it's much more fact-based. So you see where the conundrum can happen in this process.
So anytime a programmer is trying to make a machine do something, there's tests. And the tests are the definition of right. And if it fails the test, then, okay, we need to change the code somehow. So any kind of system, we have to be able to test it. So if it's a GPT model, we have to be able to give it prompts, and we have to assert that it gives the response that we are expecting. Right. Do you think in that line, or how do you think about engineering these systems and making sure that they do what we want them to do?
Well, see, that's the point. The point is I think where we're at with a lot of this Chat GPT and things is we're expecting the systems to give us what we want. And that's not always what we should do, right? Because at the end of the day, the system shouldn't just give us what we want, but it should be able to root that want in something that's factual. Because when you go for just affirmations, that's the dangerous side of things, right? That's the propaganda you and I dealt in the military, where people felt that maybe the government that they were in was bad, so we just affirmed to them that yes, it is, and we keep telling them that, and eventually that fact becomes fact at the end of the day, and it may not always be fact as I run into. Because sometimes those motivating factors come in with their own set of biases to get somebody to move or do something in a specific direction. I'll give you a for instance. So I went to Chat GPT and I said, I want to understand how to write this code to interact with this thing. It gave me a very fact-based approach only told me the facts about how to integrate that code, right?
Mm-hmm.
Didn't give me anything but what I asked. I went over and then I asked it, I said, tell me how petroleum is made, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it went into how petroleum was made, but then it went into the leading stuff. But we're trying to get rid of petroleum. We're trying to do this. There's some alternate sources. Here are some alternate sources. And it wrote more about getting rid of petroleum than it did answering the question.
But even scientists are arguing over how petroleum is made. So if the people who are experts in that field don't agree, how are we to expect a program?
Well, hold on. I don't mean there was an argument about how petroleum was made. There was a section about, I don't know, a couple paragraphs about how petroleum was made. No argument, because you and I both know that that's a thing.
Well, no, that's what I'm telling about. There are scientists that are still arguing about how petroleum is made and how long it takes. Does it take 50 years, 500, or 5 gajillion? There's arguments about that in the scientific community. So there is no accepted fact yet around that.
Right. So rather than explain that, right, in the question that I asked, it went into ulterior sources that we're trying to get rid of petroleum because we'd rather replace it with this, that, and the other thing, right? And to me, in a court of law, that's now leading. I asked you a very specific question. You're now leading me in a different direction, and you really didn't answer the question that I asked, right? Because I was expecting to see just that. There is a debate about these said things, yada, 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 yada. But when you went with the leading side of it and you started spending more time talking about the leading side of what was happening, now you've detracted from what was originally asked. And that, to me, is the very danger of what AI can do, right? Because you and I both know you can influence people by telling them the same thing over and over and over again. But that does not convince them that it's right. That just tells them they need to have this type of opinion about something, rather than giving them the data that they needed to formulate whether that opinion is. Because let's say I went into that chat scenario the way you would from a lawyer perspective. I would have gone in and said, so tell me how to make petroleum. And they go into what you and I know. There's debates on whether this is, and going through the fact-based history of how petroleum was done. Then I would have asked, are there any alternatives to petroleum? Is there another way for us to look at this? And then it answered that question. That would then be much more factual from a court of law style perspective, right? Because now you're answering the questions that I'm asked. But right now, you're answering questions I never asked, which means you're leading me to a path. Because then I started thinking, because then I'm looking at it going, well, what does that mean? And then I'm asking about green energies, and I'm not asking about the very question that I came in. So if you're looking at this from a teacher perspective, right? What did I really learn from that? I learned that petroleum was bad and I need to go down this other path. I didn't really learn what I should have had discussing about the very topic we're talking about, because we live in a world where petroleum is just gas, but a lot of people don't know that petroleum goes into a lot more than just that. So in order to get rid of that, we've got a laundry list of where it sits, and there's a lot more discussion than just gas to get rid of that, and just alternative energies. That's only a fraction of.
We have to stop using plastic for anything.
Exactly. So that's where it got me. That's what got me into a lot of this. Is like I can show people, because I've done nothing more than interacted with Chat GPT and all of them very specifically to say, I want to ask a question and I want to see what your resulting answer is. I want to see where that takes me. What follow-up questions do I generate? Why do I generate them? Because to me, it has to be in the realm of ask and answer to lead to fact, not drive me towards a point and section me off and get me to go this way. And now I'm not asking the very questions that I really needed to have over here.
So is that inherent in the generative pre-trained transformer technology, GPT, or is that inherent in how OpenAI chose to label and include data in their model?
That is a trained point, which means somebody programmed it to train that. And I'll challenge you, if you want to have some fun, go ask about the last 50 presidents. Go ask about them and watch its response according to what you know as fact of today, and watch how it responds to you, which means to me, if I look at that and I go in and I go, let's go ahead and see, you have to put variables in like a developer, right? we go in and we go to test our stuff. How do we test it? Well, we put in things that we know a result's going to come out. Then we put in things where we know it's going to be bad. Then we put in exceptions so that we can see how it's going to react to all the different points in that coding structure, right? It's the same point in this. You'll run into a bunch of things to where, you go ask about certain historical figures and they'll come back with disclaimers, but you don't have those disclaimers over other certain historical figures that had their own struggles during their time, right? So when I look at that, I go, okay, that's not about what a historical, like a model would do, where it goes, this guy had some things that were done over here, so we'll put some disclaimers on. I'm putting disclaimers around just the people that I'm mentioning, not around the data that I'm seeing, which is a different thing to me. And that's where bias enters the arena at that point, because somebody programmed those in to say, when you see this specifically, this is what you need to do. That's not a Chat GPT thing to me. That's not a model train or a learned attribute, if that makes sense.
So there's so many opinion articles in various types that are published. Is that the result of choosing to include those opinion publications that had, say, negative statements or cautionary statements about historical figures? Or do you think there's actual programming, like if statements, on top of the model?
With the frame at which the disclaimers were mentioned, it was not done based on articles, right? When you and I know, if we taught a writing model how to write, right? And we were going in and picking a subject, and there was a gray area in a subject, there's a way to notate that when in your research, right? Where you go in and go, hey, here's this data presented. We don't know really how this data affects it. Our outcome was based on how we interpreted this data. That would be a disclaimer to me. That would be a disclaimer that would have been generated from looking at something or a model looking at an historical set of data points, right? But it's not when it looks at something very specifically and gives a output based on that particular piece or time in history and not what's written about it, right? Saying, I would have expected to say, hey, this was a controversial aspect, coming up. Our data, we're going to present the data to you in such a way that, it just provides the facts, but this is all we have around the subject. It hasn't really been confirmed or not confirmed or, something along those lines, right? But I'm talking dead disclaimers of, hey, we this is being presented to you, even though it's controversial, we're going to present it to you. And that is programmed at that point.
Okay. So for developers who want to kind of integrate some GPT tech into their applications, and they think, you know what, I'm going to develop my own model. What's the design process look like? How should they go about doing that?
Well, the design process at that point really goes to what they're trying to focus on. And I'll give you, for instance, we were looking at creating a speaking platform using AI to teach young speakers how to generate PowerPoint presentations and how to set them up based on my MCT knowledge, my Microsoft certified trainer knowledge, and how to deliver content, right? So we wanted to create a system that did nothing more but trained folks on how to get to that point. So we would ask for what their subject was, we do all this stuff, and then we would generate a presentation for them based on that, right? So when you look at things like that, there are aspects of models that we would train, because we would train a model that was very specific to only providing presentations, so that somebody couldn't come out like we saw with Microsoft's Bing version, where somebody can make the AI very hateful because it wasn't focused. It was trying to cover all this different stuff, and somebody could make it sound really bad. We didn't want that from teaching somebody how to present, because the point wasn't because the content that went in it, but how to deliver that content, like you and I have learned, right? So the aspect of the model is, I'm one of those that I'm more of a purist. I don't think folks should generate their own models, because when you do that, you introduce consequences that you don't expect. And especially around your belief structures that you may not understand are being put into them without really looking at that. So I'm the court of law guy. I look at things going, I want a model that's rooted in fact. I want it to be able to use that fact to figure things out versus me trying to tell it what its facts need to be and trying to build that model in a controlled way so I get the result that I'm expecting. AI is not result oriented. That's like, you and I's kids that we go out and we want them to be a doctor. So all we're going to do is focus on everything to shape them into a doctor, right? We don't do that. We hope that's the pattern that they go to, but we want to expand their minds to where they discover that's the path they want to go on, right? We don't try to mold them into that. So that's where that conundrum comes from me. When you start creating your own, you're molding things into what your expected outcome is supposed to be. And that may be good, like in our scenario where we're doing a very specific training point, or it could be bad if you're trying to do something else, especially if you're looking at a school system or something like that wants to try to generate their own model around what their curriculum is. Well, is that a good curriculum or a bad curriculum? Is that curriculum rooted in fact? I think if we've seen coming down from the school systems, there's some things that are gray, there's some things that are very anchored, and there are other things that aren't. So is that really what we want to build that model off of, right?
So you're not in favor of building your own models because it's a huge undertaking?
Yes, it's a huge undertaking, and you introduce things that you least expect. So my point on the model is, I think the model should go out to the internet, back to your point, use the whole internet, but it has to be able to throw the BS flag when it needs to know that this is an opinion over this is fact, right? And that's how we as human beings have to battle things every day. When we talk to our friends or we get into something, we have to be able to decipher what is fact and what is an opinion.
Our society struggles with that.
Exactly. So you have to think that as people develop or people go down this path, our struggles in society equate to the struggles in technology. And that's not always what we want.
Okay, so with your take being that a model is a huge undertaking and it's better to use one of the ones that have already been invested heavily in, do you have some favorite GPT models currently?
I currently don't, because I'm testing them all. So I don't have any favorites just yet. I tend to use Chat GPT's latest 4.0. I try to stay up on the Chat GPT models and their latest just to see. But my first question whenever I go in is, when was the model last updated? So I can see what their dates up to that model are, if that makes sense. Like 3.5 was only up to October of 2022. So you have to go in and start looking at where these models are, what data they're including, so that you can understand where all that data is coming from, if that makes sense.
Gotcha. Okay. Wow. This is a fascinating conversation. We could probably go on for some time to come, but I appreciate you coming back on the show and talking with us about responsible AI.
Yes, sir.
Awesome. And until next time, keep shipping.
You've been listening to the Azure DevOps Podcast, a show for developers and DevOps professionals shipping software using Microsoft technologies. Go to www.azuredevops.show for show notes and other episodes. On behalf of your host, Jeffrey Palermo, and our sponsors, thanks for listening, and may God bless you.